Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Rahul Oka from Notre Dame. We're going to discuss immigration, migration, and the political and social causes that lead to those decisions. Dr. Oka also just spoke today at our conference on immigration, conflict, climate, and consequences that was sponsored by the Purdue Northwest Center for Global Studies. And he gave a presentation to the 300 people that were there. Thank you for that. But several of the things that you presented in your contribution to the conference, I wanted to use that as an opening to have this discussion. So one of the things you said at the beginning was that you define migration as, or migrants. There's good migrants, there's bad migrants, and then there's ugly migrants, which seems, I mean, the good, the bad, and the ugly is a nice phrase, but could you explain what you see as the differences between those types of migrants?
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I just want to make it clear that the good, the bad, and the ugly is sort of the way I've looked at it, but it's more the way societies see different kinds of migrants. And so the good migrants are sort of, upper class professional. When they come in, when they migrate to places, they go with known skills. It's legal. They're desired, and their journeys are very short. They're very safe, and it's a sustainable migration. And then there's the bad migration, which is, again, people, or the bad migrant, whatever you want to call it. And again, it's like the ones who are undesired by their destination countries, but they don't have known skills, capital, abilities. It's mainly economic migration, so people are moving for a greater opportunity, or they're leaving really bad, terrible conditions behind. And there is no legal protection. The journeys are not safe, and they usually take very, very dangerous, arduous journeys, and cross borders, and they live in the extra legal world. So that's beyond the realms of legal protection. And then there's the ugly migration, which is the one that has complications that refugees, internal displaced peoples, or asylum seekers, they're fleeing persecution, they're fleeing conflict, war, genocide, mass atrocities, sometimes natural disasters that have laid waste to their houses. So forces beyond their or anybody's control, and they cross borders, so they create a moral obligation to help them. 193 countries around the world have signed accords like the 1951 Refugee Convention, 67 Protocol, to give protection and so on and so forth. But again, undesirable. Their safety is...
You didn't ask them to come.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't ask them to come, and that's the biggest problem with the bad and the ugly parts of the migration is that they're seen as a burden, even though in the long term, migrants usually work to the benefit of the society that they're actually going through, and every study has essentially shown that.
And also the international protocol is that we should be humanitarians. So if there's refugees or somebody fleeing violence or a climate condition, we should be good-willed and help them out. But it doesn't always turn out that way.
It doesn't.
Well, this leads me to another thing that you presented today. You said it's not so much that people cross geographic boundaries. It's not so much that people will come into the U.S. across the Rio Grande or some other entry point, or they get on a boat in northern Africa and go across the Mediterranean, so they're in another geographic location. But your point was that it's not so much the geographic borders or boundaries, but it's the social borders and boundaries. People may be speaking a different language. They may have different cultural habits. They may have different religions. I don't know. There's a whole host of things that seem to challenge how much goodwill we can show to these people. So I thought you might want to expand on that a bit.
Yes, I mean, because basically when we look at migration just through the lens of sociality, we live in settled communities now, and we've lived in settled communities for at least the past 6,000, 7,000 years, ever since urbanism and the rise of the initial states. And those have certain defined social boundaries by convention and by culture, right? I mean, this is our society, this is our social structure. And when people from the outside come in, they challenge it because it's a challenge to your way of life. They bring in different foods, different ideas, different religions. And the biggest problem that actually happens is how does the society that is there work with these new ideas that are brought in? Because at a particular point, I mean, you're not just talking about different ways of eating. You're actually talking about different eschatologies, right? Different worldviews entirely. I mean, if you have two different religions coming in, that's already a problem. What happens if the new religion is much more fun or much more conducive? And so basically, what happens is that people are very good at reaching across boundaries to make friends and so on and so forth, but like with guests, even with relatives, there's a particular limit to how much our hospitality goes. And that's, I think, very true for human societies, which is why we have always dealt with migration, because migration has gone on for millions of years now. People have moved. But whenever people come into interact with each other, that's when you can actually get problems starting, and they can either be benignly solved or they can be violently solved.
It reminds me of the myth of the U.S. being a melting pot. Everybody comes and you stir everything together, but I know when I was a kid I didn't like onions, so it's all in the pot, but I'm going to take this out and I'm going to take that out. I don't like this. And that seems often to happen, which suggests then that migration is less of a process like it used to be historically from early times when people migrated from Africa and around the world, and that's how we have these different cultures and languages. So now that migration is not just a process, but now migration is a problem. But it strikes me that it might be a constructed problem.
Yeah.
That it's not just, because if anybody travels to a different country, people, when they come back, they say, oh, they were so nice. They're just like us. But somehow when they become migrants or immigrants, it's like they're challenging, they're changing us too much. So I don't know, maybe from a process to a problem is something that has to be constructed for a particular society.
Absolutely. And the thing is that it's always been in the interest of the state as a political unit. I mean, we spoke about this a little briefly, but control of the borders of your state is very important. Control of your political unit is very important. And it's not so much that the people who are coming in are going to give problems, but the uncertainty about what they might or might not do gives you a very, very good political hook to say we need to control the borders because those people are actually coming in. And so when you construct the border, I mean, borders are completely human constructions. Yeah. Right?
I mean, think about colonialism in Africa. There was no border between Nigeria and Ghana. The British draw it. Right?
Exactly.
So the border suddenly becomes a problem for somebody coming from, say a Ghana migrant going into Nigeria becomes we have to protect our borders from those Ghanaians. But historically, they might have been all from the same tribe.
Precisely, and it's happened so many times. I mean, the place that I work in Kenya, you have the Ateker people that would move around the areas between Uganda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya.
They're nomadic?
So they're pastoralists and they move. Pastoral. But the national boundaries have actually created the problems for the people. And for the state, boundaries are very important. That's why you have maintain armies. You need to maintain your territorial integrity. And from an old anthropological structuralist analysis, where danger comes in from the outside, right? And migrants are actually seen as dangerous. I mean, they have all the potential to be beneficial, but they also have the potential to be problematic. And they might not be problematic for your people, but they're problematic for your rule. They're problematic for your status quo.
Yeah, well, in this case, it would be the government or the state, and maybe the corporations that they represent. But when you're talking about defending the border, it's interesting that there is not the same kind of defense or a wall at the border with Canada, but there is with Mexico. So again, I'm just observing that there's a construction.
Yes.
Canadians are like us. They're
Yeah.
blonde, they speak English. Mexicans aren't like us. They're affiliated with cartels and
Exactly.
right, and they
Yeah.
speak a different language and they have a different way of being. So they're a danger to our
Yeah.
culture, but Canada isn't.
Yeah, and it's also like a massive cultural break, right? I mean, between, when you look at the borderlands, they belong to Mexico. Santana sold them to the U.S. To fund his wars, but then you got the Anglo-American North. With Canada and the U.S., and then you got the Latin American, the Spanish,
Yeah.
Portuguese-speaking southern part, and you find that break that is replicated from Europe. You find that replicated here. So there's a historical and cultural reasons for that, but also the fact that both the U.S. and Canada being central to global economies. I mean, their economies have largely been the ones that have. There's a reason why people come across the border. They risk death. They risk everything. People traveling in families, they are risking everything. And at some point, when you ask people why you do that, it's like, well, there is the dimmest of hope that I might be able to build a better life for me, my children, or something like that in these countries.
One of the things that was said today in the conversation at the conference was the idea is in the United States that there's this pull, that the U.S. is pulling, right, the opportunity to get rich. And one of the speakers suggested, well, there's also the push, because it's not like I've decided today
Exactly.
I'm going to move to the U.S. to become rich, but you're being pushed because either the conflict, like if there's a military government or a coup in Honduras or somewhere, or if the climate has deteriorated to such a point that you can't grow crops and you're an indigenous farmer, you have really not a whole lot of choice except to go somewhere else.
Absolutely.
So,
this is what happened when the Irish migration happened, when the people came from Central Europe. And there's a great work by Noel Ignatieff about how the Irish became white.
yeah.
And where, you actually have Irish, Italian American, Central European, Italian immigrants going through the same kind of discrimination from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant groups until they whitened themselves over the years. And in some ways, you see repeats of this particular process where what group is okay to be here and what group is not actually changes over time.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about the theme of the conference today, because the theme was immigration, and it suggested that conflict, U.S. interventions, U.S. occupations, and climate are some of those things that are pushing people towards migration. So would you speak to those two things a bit?
Yes, absolutely, and I want to bring it out that when we look at migration, I do cultural anthropology or economic anthropology of migration, but I'm also an archaeologist of state societies and look at migration, conflict, commerce in the past as well. And one of the things that we know is that conflict and climate change are basically your universal constants for migration. But it's right now we're essentially seeing this ratcheting up of climate-related negative trends and climatic shocks and conflicts. And basically what happens is that climate and conflict are correlated. We're still trying to figure out how exactly they're correlated, but there seems to be a correlation. It's leading with food security, governance security, and growing inequality. They feed into each other. And they've always created conditions where it's untenable to live here anymore. So you essentially move. Now, my expertise, of course, not in the Americas. My expertise is more in East Africa, where the refugee camps that I've been researching in, most of the people have moved because of conflict, right? They're fleeing mass atrocities, they're fleeing genocide, warlords, militia, and so on and so forth. But climate has played a huge role. because resource scarcity is linked to conflict, people who are productive.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the U.S. and Syria. If you blow up an oil refinery,
Yep.
it's not just the refinery, the water's polluted.
Yep.
And if you're blowing up a bridge or
Yeah.
a building, it's not just, again, the building's gone. Well, yeah, but now there's a soil pollution and
Exactly.
maybe air pollution. So, I don't know if there's been much research on this, but it's interesting that some of these actions end up with a climate consequence, but that doesn't make the headlines in the paper. What makes the headlines is shock and awe, or the number of people's lives have been saved, but not the environmental
Yes.
consequence that's going to be around for a long time. So.
Exactly, and both the short-term and the downstream effects of our activities. So, I mean, if you just take a simple example, right? You're pushing for economic growth, and one way to get economic growth is to expand lateral use of land and water. And then suddenly you're caught in a cycle because of you constantly need to keep on expanding your land and water use in order to maintain a particular economic growth, because your population is growing and so on and so forth. Then what happens if your production is shocked by climate, it's shocked by conflict and everything?
Or
like
if you
that?
suck all the water.
Exactly, which is what is happening in the U.S. right now with the aquifers, right?
Yeah.
And so here's the conundrum, because I mean, like usually people see migration as people going from areas where there's really little, which is true, to areas where there's something, and that is still true, but all the recent news from the U.S., from Western Europe, essentially suggests that we are not immune from climate shocks.
Yeah.
And basically, the systems that we've essentially put into place and the constant back and forth between should we protect the environment, should we prioritize the economy, they've essentially led to like a mishmash of things where we want to protect the environment, but our votes depend on giving people jobs and building factories and so on and so forth. So we're still chasing that particular dream of like, okay, let's expand water use, let's expand land use, but then what do we do when we run out of water? I mean, Arizona is a huge example.
Yeah.
I was there last year, and there are these orchards of nut and
Yeah.
fruit trees.
Where do they get the water? Yeah.
These are all getting the water from the aquifers, and these are the most water expensive crops you can ever imagine. And to grow them in a desert is insane.
Yeah.
And who is consuming most of these things? It's basically buyers and consumers in the Middle East, because they can't grow those over there.
Not
So they-
anymore.
yeah, exactly. And now it's going to be problematic to grow them in Arizona on a sustained level, and local farmers are complaining because they're running out of water. Right? So that's what I was actually talking about, right? These are wicked problems, because each one by itself, if you think of migration as a emergent property of bad governance, and I'm talking about the bad and ugly migration. I'm not
Yeah.
talking about the good migration.
Yeah.
Good migration goes on regardless, and it's like everybody satisfies themselves. But bad governance, inequality and poverty, conflict, and climate change, these have a disproportionate impact on those who have little, and basically they lead to migration. But in turn, migration is also linked with conflict, because migration can create conflict when people are moving
yeah.
across. They fight. The violence can break out. I mean, I've seen violence in refugee welcoming centers where two groups that are just completely battered by the journeys and everything like that, they're fighting each other. And even if you want to separate them, you understand that they're both traumatized.
Yeah.
They've been through the most harrowing kind of journeys. And so it becomes this situation where every solution you bring, it might or might not actually solve the problem, but it also creates 10 more problems for you to solve, because these are what we call the unintended consequences, or the hidden externalities.
Like BP dumps oil and waste into the Lake Michigan, but it's not we'll pay the fine, but it's really not our problem. It's something for the state of Indiana to solve. It's not, so it strikes me that, again, it goes back to the idea that somebody made a decision to function in some way that has a consequence that's going to end up with migration, whether it's, from Florida to Indiana, or from Indiana to the northern peninsula of Michigan, because you're trying to escape the heat. But on a global scale, it's more dramatic. It's just, we're talking 150 million migrants that will be displaced by climate over the next 10 years.
And that's just climate.
That's just climate,
Yeah.
and we're not talking about conflict. Because if we talked about conflict, you'd talk about like the Ukraine war. 6 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine so they don't get drafted, which makes sense, I guess. But they go to Germany, they go to Russia, they go to other countries. They even end up here in Indiana.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say the bulk of them are women, women and children. But then can you imagine what happens because they actually have an embargo on men leaving.
Oh, yeah.
18 to 53. But then there's huge IDP issues now because the people who went to the war, they have sudden, like, you know, they have PTSD, they're war veterans, they have missing limbs and everything like that. And what do you actually do in that particular situation? So yeah, this is going to be the biggest problem for us because there is no upside if we can't solve climate change, if we can't solve inequality and poverty, if we can't solve conflict, and if we can't solve governance. Migration is going to be the thing that we're going to be dealing with.
That's right. And that's going to create additional problems. So I know you do most of your work in Kenya and Sudan, so I thought maybe we don't have a lot of time left, but I thought maybe I'd give you an opportunity to speak about that because you talked about 2 or 3 camps in Kenya. There were 45,000 in one, 185,000 in another, and then the huge one was 285,000 people all living in these camps, and sometimes you said people live their whole life there. They might have come when they were 10 or 15, and they may end up dying there 40 or 50 years later. So,
absolutely.
Because one of the things that disturbed me a little bit was your suggestion that we have these camps. There's not really any way to get rid of these camps. We have migration. There's not a solution to migration. So we kind of have to just adjust our perspective so what we can do. And one of the things you said was, well, the UN could designate these as humanitarian camps, and then more resources could be provided. But what would lead you to think that already the Western Europe and the United States is already reluctant to provide money and change and opportunity for refugees in general? Under what conditions do you think something like that is possible? Because that's what you were saying. This is a possible compromise.
The reason is because the camps are not here, right? They're there.
We'll keep them there.
And when they're there, people will pay to keep them there, and it actually works out to people's benefit. And I don't mean to be mercenary about it because I've been working in these camps since 2007, right? I have lived in these camps. I've essentially lived with the people. I've slept in their homes. I've eaten with them, cried with them when things have happened. And what you realize is that and so my suggestion was not so much for these refugee camps. I mean, that was like, no, you can pump in a little bit more money to make them better and stop going for market modalities because they're not going to work.
Yeah.
But you are not going to recreate thriving market systems in these camps. These are traumatized people. But the system that there is enables millions of people across the world who live in these UN-protected camps to survive. And if you can survive, you have hope.
I think I get more radical as I get older because my acceptance of the world that we live in, the world in crisis, is less amenable to that. I mean, you even pointed out in your presentation that 60% of the money that goes to refugees around the world comes from the U.S. And I don't know what that total amount is, but I know the U.S. spends $1 trillion on its military operations, and probably more next year. So if I balance these out, that just to me seems to be unacceptable, and that's what I want to address. But we're out of time, and this isn't my interview. So Dr. Rahul Oka, thank you. It's all the time we have on our program. I want to thank Dr. Oka for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.